At 9,000 feet, the night froze into an unnatural hush. The forest fell silent, as if sound had been cut from the world. Beyond the cabin windows, a flat band of light appeared. Not a beam, not a spotlight, but the air itself beginning to glow. The cabin stood at 9,200 feet above sea level on the northern edge of a high plateau east of Gunnison, Colorado. Its frame was cut from spruce beams, heavy and squared, assembled with the blunt practicality of a place meant for weather, not style. The roof pitched steeply, shedding storms before they could settle. The shutters were plain, hinged iron against wood, and the veranda wrapped along the southern face with enough space for chairs that had been bleached gray by a dozen winters. Inside, the essentials had been laid out with a kind of calculated austerity. A small propane tank fixed outside on its pad, a backup battery block connected to a switch panel, and a compact generator kept in its own outbuilding to mute the sound. A laminated sheet explained in dry bullet points how to operate it, what voltage to expect, and how long each run should last before fuel was conserved. The furnishings were stripped of personality. A wooden table with 2 benches, a short bookshelf with a scattering of field guides, a wall clock powered by a quartz module that had probably been hanging there for years. A carbon monoxide detector sat on the upper wall near the stove. 2 handheld radios, boxed and labeled, had been left for use, along with a sealed first aid kit. Near the door hung laminated evacuation maps, outlining fire roads in red, with numbers keyed to ranger station codes. The floor bore the scratch marks of boots and gear, but the surface had been cleaned with an almost impersonal regularity. A visitor's journal lay open on the entry table, its last pages noting the previous renters who had left in September. Outside, the clearing pressed into a shallow corridor of pine and fir, climbing sharply toward ridges marked with stunted aspen. The air was dry and unyielding, the kind of air that carried little scent but amplified every crack of branch. 100 yards to the east, the skeletal remains of an old corral leaned against the encroaching tree line, fence rails collapsing into the brush. There were no neighboring cabins within a mile. Cell service registered weekly only when standing on the western rise, where a tower caught signal through the saddle. Down in the clearing itself, the reception died, leaving the radios and the modem as the only tenuous contact outward. The week of rental was fixed from October 18th through the 25th. Hunting season was ending. Snow had not yet set in. Days ran short, light fading early behind the ridges, nights settling cold without moisture. On the first evening, the air carried faint calls of small owls. Geese migrated overhead, high enough that their formation was a pattern more sensed than seen. The wind came down steadily through the saddle, a colder current that scraped through the clearing and passed on into the valley below. By dusk, the cabin was sealed, the stove lit, the logs of spruce popping quietly in the heat. The generator ran with a muffled tone, positioned downhill so that its hum was absorbed by slope and soil. Initial routines were set with care. The visitor's journal received neat entries. Temperature noted, the condition of the stove, the level of propane in its tank. A line marked the sound of the generator, described as faint and nearly lost beneath the walls. 2 trail cameras were taken from the storage cabinet and mounted, one at the edge of the meadow, the other at a junction where 2 narrow paths merged before vanishing into timber. Each unit was checked for infrared function and battery charge. Their clocks were synchronized to the quartz wall clock, which in turn had been adjusted by radio signal to match the official time standard. The synchronization was precise, down to the second, a detail written into the journal as though anticipating comparison later. On the veranda, a steel bowl was set with water, left deliberately near the steps. Tracks around the cabin suggested deer moved through at night, so the bowl was left as a marker, a means of gauging whether animals would return. A stick of chalk was placed beside it, ready to mark the edges of ice if freezing occurred. These preparations were not urgent, only systematic, the kind of habits drawn from an interest in measurement. The cabin itself remained still. The outer temperature slipped below freezing. No unusual sounds pressed through the walls, only wind combing across the clearing and the rhythmic shift of timbers settling against their bolts. Past midnight, a discrepancy surfaced. At 2 a.m., the wall clock showed a delay of 42 seconds compared to the reference phone that still carried faint signal on the ridge. It was an error too small to raise alarm, but large enough to be written in the journal. The explanation was simple. The quartz module inside the clock was old, the battery not recently replaced. Yet the details stood out, small but definitive, a marker that something within the cabin was not perfectly aligned. At 2:17 a.m., another observation was made. The background sounds of the interior seemed to fall away. The refrigerator's faint compressor, the continuous thrum of the generator, the random settling creaks of timber, all of them diminished, not silenced, but recessed, as though distance had opened between source and ear. A decibel meter left on the table showed steady figures, 28 to 30 dBA, no fluctuation from baseline. The equipment insisted nothing had changed, but perception said otherwise. The sensation was logged in the margin of the journal as diminished noise perception without elaboration. The night otherwise remained uneventful. By morning, the silence dissolved into ordinary rhythm again. The generator ticked, the stove emitted its low mechanical draw, and the clock held its seconds as if nothing had shifted. Outside, the driveway showed narrow tracks where a coyote had passed before dawn. Thin frost glistened on the handrails of the veranda. The clearing stretched outward into muted daylight, air still brittle, carrying no scent. The cabin remained as it had been built, self-contained, its systems in place, its logs marked with the kind of order that left no room for commentary. On the second day, the clearing revealed itself in sharp light, cold and stripped of moisture. The air above the plateau remained crystalline, the edges of the forest stark against the sky. Inside the cabin, new instruments were arranged with quiet order. A compass was placed on the southern windowsill, its needle steady under the pale sun. Beside it, a small inclinometer was set, its bubble aligned at 0. Each was positioned not for immediate need, but as markers of change, the kind of tools left in place to be observed passively. A rope line was stretched from the cabin door down the narrow trail toward the meadow where the first camera stood, its fiber rough beneath the hand, a guide meant for moving at night without light. The radio modem was tested again. The connection stuttered, breaking into fragments, but managed to send out packets slowly, enough for mail to pass with delay. The link dropped and returned unpredictably, but data confirmed it had reached the outside. The signal, fragile, was sufficient to be noted in the journal as intermittent but functional. By midday, steps carried upward to the saddle that overlooked the plateau. Beyond the tree line, the slope changed to scree and fractured stone, its incline catching wind in a steady, unbroken current. The sky was washed pale blue, a flat dome without cloud. Deer moved at distance, silhouettes shifting through the brush, their forms absorbed by the tree line before full detail could be gathered. The climb remained simple, unremarkable, the kind of ascent that tested breath but not resolve. At 1540, the return to the cabin brought with it an altered perception. The forest that had carried the constant scatter of sound through morning hours seemed to collapse into stillness. Bird calls fell away, leaving no rhythm from branches. The occasional crack of boughs settling under their own weight was absent. The wind pressed through the trees but carried no voice, as though its passage had been wrapped in insulation. Each step on pine needles echoed faintly, not through volume but through contrast with the absence around it. The silence settled with weight, not the calm of dusk, but the extraction of sound itself. The journal received a careful note. Forest quieted beyond normal, wind audible but dampened. By dusk, the first set of images from the cameras was retrieved. The sequence began predictably. A squirrel clinging to the pale bark of an aspen, a deer pausing near the meadow's fringe, its eyes reflecting the infrared glow. Then a run of emptiness, frames showing no visible subject. The exposure was correct, the light balanced, the colors stable. Yet in the span of 15 minutes, the meadowgrass appeared altered. Blades lay at different angles across successive frames, flattened not in chaotic patches, but along a smooth arc, as though weight had pressed evenly through a section of the clearing. The human eye on the ground found no clear track. Approaching with a flashlight, one section near the meadow's edge seemed disturbed, a subtle depression where the grass bent downward in a flattened sweep. No imprint of hoof or boot, only the impression of a palm pressed into the earth's surface. The detail was slight, more sensed than measured, but it was logged nonetheless. At 1912, the compass needle quivered. The movement was not rotation, but a visible tremor, as though caught between currents that did not shift direction. The arrow vibrated, then stilled, pointing north without deviation. 9 minutes later, the inclinometer recorded a tilt of 1/10 degree toward the northeast corner of the cabin. The bubble shifted, held for a few moments, then returned to center as though nothing had occurred. At 1940, cell signal became erratic. Text messages were transmitted, but voice calls carried no speech. When connected, the line held a steady hum of silence, not distortion, only a uniform low frequency that suggested connection without content. Each attempt ended the same way, a channel open but empty. Night closed over the clearing. The rope line led from the cabin door through darkness, its fibers cold and rough against the hand. The meadow stretched open, stars casting clarity into the air. The sky's pattern carried its constellations sharply. A jet crossed at altitude, its position lights flashing in regular rhythm, but no sound descended from its passage. The absence was stark. The flashlight was extinguished. The rope alone marked direction. Then, without transition, illumination appeared. At the upper end of the field, behind the line of aspens, a band of light formed. It was not a beam and not a directed lamp. It did not cut through the darkness, but occupied it, a matte strip of atmosphere glowing with subdued radiance. Its hue was amber diluted with gray, color without strength, saturation low but steady. The band lay horizontally, its edges diffuse, spreading across the air as though the air itself carried light. It persisted for more than a minute, unbroken. The trees cast no shadows from it. The grass shone faintly without glare. Physiological response followed in silence. A heaviness settled in the ears, the kind of pressure registered during descent in an aircraft. The sensation of air pressing against the canal without relief. No wind rose, no mechanical sound accompanied it. The band simply diminished, fading into the tree line until the meadow returned to blackness. At the cabin, the observation was recorded in the journal with restraint. The words noted horizontal luminous band and its duration, followed by the physical sensation of pressure. No conclusions were drawn, no speculation marked. The entry remained plain, facts stripped of interpretation. Outside, the clearing lay still, and the slope beyond held its silence, as though the air itself had closed against sound. The third morning carried no visible change in the landscape, but instruments inside the cabin revealed a series of irregularities. One of the trail cameras, when its memory card was checked, contained a run of image files, each weighing precisely 3.2 megabytes. They were valid data packages, their headers intact, yet when opened, they displayed only uniform blank frames. The digital imprint existed, but no image could be discerned. The other files stored in the same folder showed ordinary content: shadows of branches, a passing elk, the gradations of twilight. The discrepancy was recorded in the journal with time and file count. At 08:17, the quartz wall clock shifted forward unexpectedly. Without anyone adjusting its battery or mechanism, the hands jumped 2 full minutes ahead of the synchronized phone reference. The battery remained seated, voltage stable. The change was abrupt, not gradual drift, and marked in the log as advance of 120 seconds. The compass placed on the sill no longer pointed with steady bearing. Its needle wavered continuously in a 10-degree arc to the northeast, unable to settle on a fixed orientation. In the same interval, the carbon monoxide detector gave a single chirp, a short, isolated tone. Its readout showed no elevated concentration, its indicators stable. To test the range of disruption, a receiver was tuned to the county law enforcement frequency. The sheriff's channel carried its routine transmissions without anomaly. Vehicle stops, time checks, ordinary patrol updates. No distortion was heard. At 11:33, a call was placed to the Forest Service office in Gunnison. The inquiry was about scheduled burns or controlled fire activity. The reply was direct. No active operations, no planned ignition, no advisories for the district. Shortly after, FAA databases were checked for flight activity. The nearest traffic corridor lay far south of the plateau, with no aircraft expected above the valley. Activity was low and no deviations had been noted. The notes were transcribed into the journal in sequence. By midday, the clearing produced its own evidence. The steel bowl set on the veranda contained water that remained liquid, though the air temperature had dropped to 23 degrees Celsius. The thermometer verified the reading twice. On the surface of the water, 2 circular marks appeared. They were equal in size, each 3 inches in diameter, where the reflection of the sky weakened, as though something opaque had pressed lightly against the surface for an extended duration. The chalk left for marking had not been moved. The outlines of the circles were drawn carefully around the rim of the bowl, measured and dated in the log. Within an hour, the marks faded, leaving the surface indistinguishable from ordinary water. At 16:10, the radio modem ceased functioning. Its indicators still reported synchronization, the connection light fixed in green, but data could not be moved through it. Test packets were transmitted to a standard host. Each returned no reply. Response times extended indefinitely, the line holding open with no feedback, as if packets had left but encountered nothing. The failure continued without variation. At 17:05, the inclinometer needle slid again toward the northeast. This time the shift was noted physically within the room. A small steel ball, taken from a bearing and placed on the tabletop, rolled gently toward the corner. It moved with steady pace, reached the angle where wood joined wood, paused, then reversed its direction and returned to center as though guided back by a hidden slope. The effect resembled a wave, a shallow tilt that shifted and corrected without visible cause. As dusk fell, the forest retained its unnatural stillness. Wind combed the high ridges without change, but the valley below seemed acoustically empty. Normal scatter from brush and undergrowth was gone. The cabin's interior grew heavy with the absence of noise. Internal sounds of the body, heartbeat, breath, the circulation of blood, seemed muted, as though the ears themselves had been insulated. The sound level meter placed on the table displayed the same values as before, an unwavering 29 to 30 decibels. The figures denied the experience. At 19:58, a vertical thread of light appeared. It formed at the upper edge of the meadow, thin and unwavering. The column was not brilliant, not radiant, but a dim shaft, as if the air itself emitted a single pale frequency. Its edges blurred into the night. It cast no shadow, produced no glare, but held in place with unnatural precision. The sensation in the clearing was one of displacement, though no sound accompanied it. The column endured for 40 seconds, and then it was gone, not by fading, but by ceasing, as if a switch had cut it out. When the trail camera was examined later, its infrared sequence had recorded the shaft. The frames showed a vertical bar, indistinct at the edges, occupying the meadow. Within that bar, the grass appeared unlike its surroundings. The stalks bent at alternate angles, their geometry inconsistent with the adjacent ground. The effect was of two separate images pressed together, their seam disguised by light. The event was documented in the journal with time and duration. No explanation followed, only the careful outline of detail, preserved without inference. The fourth night held a density that distinguished it from the others. The air reached 18 degrees, and by midnight the porch carried a brittle skin of frost. Surfaces were glazed with a fragile sheen that crackled faintly under touch. At UFO 06, the wall clock inside the cabin froze. Its hands stopped precisely at 12:06, while the phone screens continued their march without hesitation. No external jolt was observed, no battery issue recorded. The quartz module simply ceased, marking a boundary in time without explanation. At 0:19, the carbon monoxide detector sounded again, not a single chirp, but a sequence of clipped tones. Its display reported safe levels, unchanged. The sound rang against the wood panels, mechanical and insistent, then fell silent. Air in the room thickened perceptibly, heavier to draw into the lungs, as though density itself had increased without change in pressure. The journal recorded the note in sharp script: air heavy, sensor normal. By 0027, the inclinometer needle slid once more toward the northeast. This time, the steel ball on the table responded with a decisive roll into the corner. It settled at the junction of the boards and remained, refusing to return to center. The cabin itself seemed to lean on an invisible hinge. Nothing outside suggested movement. The forest remained dark, the frost undisturbed. Yet within, the tilt persisted, and no counterbalance corrected it. Out on the meadow, a new configuration appeared. It was neither band nor column, but an oval volume of light suspended 2 feet above the ground. Its shape was clean, an ellipse measuring roughly 20 by 30 feet. The glow was not radiant, it failed to cast reflection on the tree trunks. The thin frost beneath did not glitter. Instead, the surface lay matte, indifferent to illumination. The hue bordered on white, carrying only a faint suggestion of warmth. Its edges were sharply defined, like a frame cut into the atmosphere. The object remained fixed in its position, silent and unshaken. Then, without visible motion, it displaced itself by several feet. No arc, no path, no acceleration, only absence in one location and appearance in another. It remained level with the ground, the air around it unbroken. Acoustics did not alter. In the body, however, sensation shifted. The familiar undercurrent of pulse and breath faded. The low internal hum of being alive ceased, leaving the impression of hollow space, as if the body had been emptied. At EO0032, the interior lights dropped out. It was not a gradual dimming, but a snap into darkness lasting less than a second. The generator faltered, its tone collapsing to idle, then reasserted load without delay. The stove flame wavered briefly and steadied. The line in the journal held only the words, "Lights failed momentarily, power restored." The trail cameras registered the phenomenon. Their files carried proper timestamps and consistent sizes. Each image contained the oval as a flat plane of uniform light, textureless, without grain. No digital noise existed within its boundaries. Beyond it, detail remained intact: grass bent in frost, shrubs on the edge of the field, constellations overhead. One frame carried anomaly across its entirety. The whole exposure became a flawless, smooth field, absent of variation, as though reality had been reduced to a single shade. At 0033, all personal timepieces, phones, portable watches, even the digital radio, showed synchronized seconds. The next recognized mark came at 0245. The span in between did not exist in memory. No sound, no action, no perception left trace. The journal page for that interval held only a gap, a ruled line untouched by handwriting. When consciousness reasserted itself, the cabin's lights were burning, the stove radiated heat, the generator supplied power without interruption. Nothing suggested the missing hours had passed except the march of the clocks. Objects inside displayed subtle shifts. A compass lay on the table, its needle locked to the east, unmoving, rigid. The metal ball remained in the corner, motionless. On the floor, faint moisture marked the outline of shoe soles, leading from the center of the room toward the doorway. The prints were not tracked with mud, but outlined with wetness that glistened faintly on the boards. Outside on the porch, frost had melted in a single patch near the railing. The area had refrozen into a translucent skin, smooth, sealed, and free of bubbles, as though poured and set. The chalk left by the bowl of water was gone. No fragments, no powder on the boards, only absence where the stick had been. The entry in the journal ended with that note: chalk missing, location unknown. Beyond the porch, the meadow carried silence. The oval of light no longer hovered. The clearing bore no trace except the weight of what had occurred. The morning unfolded under a pale sky, thin frost still holding to the edges of the porch. By 08:45, the phone modem flickered briefly into function, enough to push a short message to the county office. At 09:12, a dispatcher returned the call. The duty officer from the sheriff's department took down the coordinates of the cabin and asked for confirmation of any immediate hazard. When informed that the disturbance involved no fire or injured persons, he marked the log and said a patrol would be sent up the ridge before noon. At 10:20, the sound of tires on gravel rose up the access road. A white department vehicle rolled into the clearing, the insignia dulled by dust, its antenna trembling in the cold wind. Two uniformed officers stepped out, boots crunching on the frozen ground. Their inspection began with the meadow, eyes fixed on the open space where the phenomenon had been seen. Within minutes, one of them pointed to a shape. A circle about 6 meters across lay pressed into the grass. The stems were bent uniformly downward, not snapped, not fractured, but weighted into a precise depression. The edge of the circle was clean, its perimeter cut sharply. Around the border lay fragments of sedge, cut ends aligned as if severed at once. Within the circle, the thin film of frost had not crystallized as it had across the rest of the field. The ground remained dark, slightly damp, as though held at a different temperature through the night. The officers documented the scene with digital photographs. They collected the memory cards from both trail cameras, noting the file counts and the sequence of timestamps. Each action was written into their field notebooks. One officer knelt to press a hand against the grass. He lifted it with nothing adhering, the surface dry and cool. They circled the area twice, searching for tracks. None led into or out of the depression. The rest of the meadow showed scattered signs of deer passage, their hooves pressing the soil in the usual irregular scatter, but the circle remained isolated, untouched. At 11:50, another vehicle arrived from the opposite direction, a Forest Service truck carrying a ranger. He carried a portable magnetometer strapped across his shoulder. After brief acknowledgement of the patrol, he moved directly to the circle. He laid out a sequence of transects across the diameter, recording readings every step. Along most of the lines, the field remained normal, but at one edge, the instrument flickered upward by +40 nanotesla. On the opposite edge, it dipped by an equal measure, -40. The fluctuations did not repeat outside the circle. The ranger noted the numbers carefully and turned the compass he had brought as cross-reference. In the center, the needle refused to fix, wavering and stuttering before swinging back north in uneven arcs. He photographed the paths leading through the trees and commented on the absence of heavy animal tracks. The presence of deer and coyotes around the perimeter contrasted with the void inside the circle. At the rear of the cabin, near the buried corner of the foundation, the patrol discovered two impressions in the frozen soil. They were ovals, each resembling the sole of a heavy boot, yet they carried no tread. The edges were smooth, the indentations 4 millimeters deep, pressed into ground that had been hardened by the freeze. They appeared abruptly, aligned toward the tree line, with no preceding steps to account for entry. The impressions were photographed, measured, and recorded. After midday, the patrol vehicle departed to return the findings. At 13:45, another presence arrived. A dark, unmarked SUV rolled into the clearing, its paint unadorned, except for a faded parking decal from a regional airport. Two men stepped out, both in plain jackets. They provided no names, no identification, beyond a brief flash of laminated cards without insignia. They asked direct questions about the time the disturbance had begun, and whether any recordings were stored beyond the trail cameras. The journal was presented. They examined the blank interval between SO 33 and SO 45, noting the gap in handwriting. They copied telephone numbers from the margin and checked the sequence of images on the cameras. Without explanation, they removed one of the devices. In exchange, they produced a slip of paper, a brief acknowledgement of property receipt, unsigned and lacking any header or reference number. By 1510, the unmarked SUV withdrew down the slope, its wheels leaving shallow cuts in the frost. The ranger remained a short while longer, writing his own account. In his report, he added a note: acoustic environment difference, meadow baseline altered. The sheriff's officers completed their paperwork, designating the phenomenon under the category of unusual light events. Their phrasing was neutral, restrained. As afternoon settled, the cabin remained under quiet scrutiny. At 1640, the radio modem revived unexpectedly, its status lights flashing in sequence. For a brief 20 minutes, data could pass. A set of messages was sent outward, attaching files and a compressed description of the events. Several confirmed delivery. Then the channel failed again, returning to its silent sync with no throughput. The wall clock resumed operation at some unknown moment. By evening it marked hours, yet its minute hand slipped occasionally, skipping forward one notch, while the second hand advanced normally. These irregularities were recorded as hour hand jumps. The carbon monoxide detector remained still, its silence notable after nights of sporadic alarms. By nightfall, the forest altered once more. The silence of previous evenings lessened. From the slopes came occasional bird calls, faint but discernible. A single branch snapped in the woods, carrying its sound naturally. The gradual return of noise suggested equilibrium, though no certainty accompanied it. The meadow lay still with its circle intact, the frost edging back around its perimeter. Inside, the air held the impression of difference, an area marked not only on the ground but within perception itself. The day closed with no further arrivals. The patrol logs were filed, the ranger drove back toward the valley, and the unmarked visitors did not return. The cabin stood alone again, the evidence reduced to impressions, measurements, and notes on paper. The journal closed with a final line: environment recovering, but marks remain. 2 weeks later, the owner of the cabin sent notice that rentals for the autumn season would be suspended. The explanation was framed around maintenance and weather, though no repairs followed. In the same period, the neighboring valley received a formal notice about a restricted flight corridor, designated as a quiet training regime. The restrictions seemed unnecessary, as the air traffic above those ridges was already sparse, but the paperwork existed nonetheless. By December, a response arrived from the county office regarding the open records request. The sheriff's report was included in photocopy, containing little more than a brief summary and 2 images attached. The photographs had been taken with a personal phone, the white balance skewed so that the grass appeared gray and lifeless. The circle was visible, though its definition was dulled by the exposure. A separate request to the Forest Service returned with a copy of internal correspondence. The phrasing was clipped, technical, single episode of unidentified luminous anomaly, no wildfire threat observed. No mention of the unmarked vehicle appeared in any page of documentation. By midwinter, the meadow lay under snow. The depression in the grass could no longer be discerned, smoothed by layers of frost and drifts. Through January and February, nothing stood out in the landscape. When the thaw arrived in April, the area revealed itself again. The vegetation rose slowly, uneven compared to the rest of the clearing. For several weeks, the circle remained distinguishable, not as a scar, but as a hesitation, grass reluctant to regain its height. By July, the distinction had closed. the ground uniform once more, but the journal still carried the line drawings of measurements, silent evidence of difference. The missing trail camera never returned. No one explained its removal. The second unit still held its data, a sequence of empty files. Each was properly sized with headers, timestamps, and identical checksums. The images themselves were not black screens nor corrupted code, but fields of persistent null, uniform brightness across every pixel. The absence of information had shape and weight, a consistent pattern of void that resisted categorization. The journal entry had already noted this form, and the files confirmed it with exact replication. Within a year, fragments of reference began to surface elsewhere. A hunter in the adjacent drainage posted an entry on his personal blog. He described seeing a movement of light along the ridge in late October, a sliding presence, soundless, pale. He attached no image, only text. Another fragment appeared in a forum dedicated to amateur radio networks. A user reported a sudden silence in the high-frequency relay stations south of the ridge, a dropout that lasted for hours and could not be traced to weather or equipment failure. Months later, in August, a group of hikers recorded a night time-lapse above the saddle. Hundreds of frames showed stars in smooth progression, but 3 carried a slim vertical shaft of brightness, faint and unwavering. It was too narrow for aurora, too even for a searchlight. The upload drew modest comments, most brief, none insistent. The cabin itself remained. New visitors arrived, their names written into the guest ledger alongside dates and weather notes. Some entries repeated familiar phrases: silence settling from the northern saddle, stillness that carried weight, a hush that did not belong to wind or wildlife. Others mentioned compass needles vibrating toward one quadrant, refusing stability. Some marked the bowl of water on the porch, how its surface would briefly turn opaque, reflecting nothing, as if the sky itself had been muted. More than one entry noted the sensation of slowed time at night, clocks disagreeing with perception. The story never became a headline. No newspaper featured it. No broadcast raised alarm. It existed as fragments, reports with minimal language, unsourced visitors, files that contained nothing but consistency, a circle of pressed stems that had not cracked underfoot. In the mountains, such traces lived like shadows of clouds without clouds, momentary overlays that appeared, settled, and dissolved. They left impressions, not explanations. By late summer, the clearing looked ordinary. The wind returned in restless waves, the birds scattered across the canopy, the generator gave its low, uneven hum at dusk. Life in the high valley slipped back into its usual rhythm. Yet the journal remained open to new entries, and the meadow, by its very geography, waited for the recurrence of silence. The pattern was fragile, but not erased. When the forest fell still again, when the water bowl dulled its reflection into a flat, matte surface, another line would be added to the record. The phrase would likely be brief as before, an observation without analysis, a notation without conclusion. It would speak only of quiet, of the shape it carried, of a presence not fully absent. And in that way, the aftertrace endured.